sir. Dr. Roop is on.
I'm muting.
Okay. Right. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have muted everyone, so we have less noise. I welcome Dr. Roop Gursahani. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you for joining us here. I know you're a very busy man, very busy doctor. Thank you for joining us. We have a good audience, actually, both on Zoom as well as on YouTube. We are very eager to hear you, listen to you, and follow what you're going to tell us, because most of us, our average age group, except one young man, is 65 out here, and many more. Thank you, Doctor. I now hand you over to our secretary, who will introduce you, and thereafter the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's talk show by Dr. Roop Gursahani. A special welcome and a good morning to Dr. Roop. Now, before I hand you over to him, I will just do a very, very brief introduction about him. Dr. Roop is a consultant neurologist and epileptologist with the PD Hinduja National Hospital, Mahim in Mumbai, and with the Hinduja Healthcare Surgical at Khar, Mumbai. He has trained at the Government Medical College, Nagpur, and Grant Medical College, and Sir Jamshedji Jijiboy Group of Hospitals in Mumbai. He is associated with the Forum for Indian Neurological Education, Life Express, Impact India, and End of Life Care India Task Force. He is a votary of living wills and advanced care planning, not only for his fellow Indians, but also for everyone, everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I present before you Dr. Roop Gursahani. It's over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And actually, as I made it very clear to the organizers, I mean, I'm actually thanking all of you in advance, because there's a bit of help that I'm going to ask you for at the end of this. So it's as much a pleasure and a privilege for me to be speaking to you. Now, do I have the screen share? Yes, screen share is on. No, you have to enable screen sharing for me.
Just a minute, sir.
Yeah, sure.
Vata sir, can you authorize from your side? I'm having a difficulty here.
Okay.
Or I think you just make me a co-host. Even that will work, I think.
Just 1 minute, doctor.
Yeah, sure. No problems. So,
am I the host, Harsha? No. Ravi?
I'm trying to get through them.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You're the co-host.
No,
now I am trying to do that, sir.
Yeah, it's not permitting.
Sir, allow me a...
Yeah, not a problem.
Sir, I have made the co-host now, sir.
Yeah, I'm the co-host now. Okay, that's fine. So now I can share. Yeah, done. Here it is. Right. I guess all of you can see this?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to. Now, the thing is that living wills and advanced care planning, these are two terms that we tend to use. But as far as we are concerned, and I'll kind of be interchanging between the two of them. And it's a little interesting that the rest of the world has gone very, very far ahead on this. In fact, almost 50 years ahead. And it's a little interesting because if you look at any other kind of medical technology, India seems to pick it up within a year or 2 years after it kind of originates anywhere. And yet, this is soft technology. This is social technology. For some reason, we are 50 years behind the rest of the world. And some of it you will understand why that is so. I mean, it's there are many reasons for it, but if there's time, we will discuss that as well. Now, this is a view of Hinduja Hospital some years ago. The skyline has changed substantially since then. My hospital used to dominate the skyline. Now it no longer does. And I suppose you recognize the building behind me. I'm about 10 kilos more than in this photograph, and some years after. This was 2011, which was when I first got interested in this topic. I was part of the medical panel that examined Aruna Shanbag, and then the Justice Kardju took on board our report, and from there on, well, this is one issue that has been part of my thinking since then. Now, Justice Kardju actually somewhat bombastically said that we are laying down the law in this connection, which will continue to be a law until Parliament makes a law. But actually, nothing changed. Even though one more judgment came out of that, nothing has really changed on the ground. And somewhere around 2015, I was to go to a course on advocacy and leadership for the American Academy of Neurology. And that was about the time I had begun thinking about where this whole issue was. And my realization first was that as a citizen, I would have no control over my own last days. And that was something that was beginning to bother me since I was more and more aware of what the situation was. And that's where, if you remember in the introduction, ELICIT, the End of Life Care in India Task Force. So in 2015, with other like-minded people, 3 national medical associations, neurologists, the intensivists, and the palliative care people, got together to see what we could do in this situation. Not saying that doctors have a stranglehold on this, but, well, in some ways, we have to accept that society as a whole expects us to kind of do our best to sort this out. More importantly, there was a kind of a change in my own practice, because as I realized as a neurologist and a physician, I could not help my patients till the last days. And there was a time when I would have to say, "Ab main kuch nahi kar sakta." And that used to hurt. So this something that was missing in my professional capabilities was my basic training in curative medicine. Now, if you understand it, curative medicine seeks to return patients to their own lives so that they can then do whatever it is that they want to do, and in their own priority. And I began to realize that I was missing out on the practice of a specialized field of medicine, which is not, which again is about the same age as this whole business of living wills and so on, about 40 to 50 years. It's called palliative medicine, which changes the focus from cure to care. And it seeks to assist patients in leading their lives and to support them in the pursuits that they wish to prioritize in the time that they have left. Now, that's a whole wide field of discussion, and I'm not really going to get into that. So I'm going to stick to the first part of my realization, the fact that I would have no control over my own last days, and I needed to do something about it. So let's think of any journey. Now, about 30, 40 years ago, I could probably head off to Goa at a moment's notice. Jump into a car or into a bus, no worry about whether there would be clean loose on the way, what I would eat, where I would stay. That doesn't work any longer. I need to plan my travel. I need information. on everything. And I think that's true of all of us. Yet, when it comes to the last journey of our lives, which is actually what do you want your illness experience to be like? Because, well, most of us don't have a choice about that last journey. We are completely clueless. Now, it's not just here. This is a problem the world over. But we probably have more time to think about this because as of now, our family structure, much though we may lament the fact that people, older people living alone and so on, no, but family networks are still in existence. So one person households in India, this was about a decade ago, was still just about 5%. In China, it had already touched 15%. South Korea, 25%. And in the Western democracies, we know that these figures are way above 30%. They are in the range of 30, anywhere between 30 and 40%. And especially in the Asian countries, we are really not prepared to handle this. How does this work out? One of the most poignant stories that I read was about this apartment complex. If you look this article up in the New York Times, it's a fairly long story that has been written out. This was an apartment complex built in the 50s, just outside Tokyo, and there are pictures of it populated by young families, kids playing, the works. Now, it is known for what is termed a lonely death because old people living alone. And unfortunately, too often, the neighbors find out that somebody has passed on when the smell tells them. So, what do people do about this? Well, this is a story from India. And this was a Mumbai couple that wrote to the president that we are old, we have nobody to take care of us. Please come and deliver us. Effectively, they were asking for a commando team from the president to evacuate them to heaven straight off. I don't think that's right. And anyway, as of now, I don't think anything has happened. And they're still reasonably okay as far as I could figure out. For some of us, especially people in the LGBT community, because they do not have immediate family or are estranged from them and are dependent on friends, making these decisions and putting them down becomes even more crucial. Now, the thing is, it's something that we are not really aware of. If anybody is asked, and this has been worked out across the world, when people are randomly asked, everybody says, I want to pass my last hours, my last days in my own bed, with my family around me, with my pets around me. But in reality, more and more of us now die in hospital. So, death effectively has been medicalized. And when people do think about it, the biggest worry is basically dying with pain and suffering. So this lovely quote from Woody Allen, I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Well, again, to prevent this suffering, there is a basic instrument that we all need to be aware of, and that is the living will. Now, to step back a bit and to figure out how this happens, how we die is, you would have thought that medical science would have thought about, but it's just about 2 decades ago that this, I'm sorry, I'm just going to, hang on, my WhatsApp is still on the laptop, I have to turn it off. Otherwise it will keep pinging away. Yeah, okay, sorry. So how we die, now, most of us wish for a sudden death. A sudden death is where literally you're absolutely okay, functioning well, high level of function, and suddenly something happens, and that's it. Some people do get it. And one of those, and he did a lot of punya, which was probably his reward for that punya, is our ex-long-haired president. But it's, again, another counterfactual. After the age of 50 years, less than 10% of people die suddenly. And that is because people who have risky lifestyles, risky behaviors, whether you think of young servicemen or stupid young men on motorcycles without helmets, or advertising executives smoking away. If biology meant to have you be carried off, then that's very likely to happen by the age of 50 years. And after the age of 50 years, once you cross that, less than 10% of people die suddenly. Towards the end of the next decade, late 60s, early 70s, the commonest thing then is cancer. And in cancer, there is a lot of treatment that is now possible, and people stay, and a fair number of people even get cured. But there is a time when cancer fails to respond to any treatment, and then it progresses inexorably. And that is, we call that the Niagara Falls trajectory. Because once the water starts falling, it has a trajectory which ends. And cancer follows this trajectory. It accounts for about 20% of all deaths. The next is, say, towards the late 60s, early 70s, and people who have bad heart, lungs, livers because of diabetes, hypertension, whatever, their organ failures start to run into crisis. So they have a crisis, end up in hospital, come back, but not as good as before. And this we call the looping trajectory. About 15% of people will undergo this. And I don't have a VIP's picture here because, VIPs get organ transplants. What about the last trajectory? And in the last trajectory, people start off at a fairly lowish level of function, elderly people, and we call that the frailty and dementia, but mainly frailty trajectory where people effectively dwindle down. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the last we heard of him was just after the loss, when the UPA first got elected, when the NDA last lost. And literally, we would hear of him once in a while until he finally passed away 2 years ago. So this is that long drawn dwindling trajectory, and about 50% of us will do this. Of course, there are people who can be older, who can be functioning pretty well, and yet, because of a catastrophic event in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, suddenly go down into that last trajectory, even though till then they have been doing literally as good as a 50 or a 60-year-old. And that is something that anybody who's in their 80s should be aware of. So, what does this mean? What is the upshot of all this that I've told you? So, except for that 10% where death is sudden, for about 90% of us, death is predictable. Some weeks, some months before it occurs. And well, a lot of us will have excuses for not looking at it in the face, but there is also an economic reason. जन्म और मृत्यु अब महंगे हो गए हैं. सिजेरियन के बिना कोई आता नहीं और वेंटिलेटर के बिना कोई जाता नहीं. WhatsApp forward during the lockdown. And then there was this thing on my Twitter feed. This was quite some time ago, last November. It suddenly exploded. And look at the number of shares. Something like 30,000 people passed it around. My grandfather passed away today. Last night, all he wanted to do was to have one last beer with his sons, which he managed to get in a hospital. Can't imagine that happening in India. Well, it's been worked out that India really is not a country to die in. Many of us will say that it's not a country to live in. I don't agree, but not to die in, that is actually been proven. This was a study which looked at the quality of death. About in 2010, we were the 40th of 40 large countries. And then in 2015, we ran it again. And fortunately, found 13 countries which were worse than us, and both Pakistan and China were below us. So we could be happy about that. Yeah, but why? If you look at this article, those articles are available for download. If you look up The Economist, you'll find them there. If anybody is interested, they really are powerful reading. There are three major problems. We are not willing to talk about them. Why does that matter? It matters because at the end of life, the most important thing is an emotional settling of accounts. It's called life review. There are last wishes, the bucket list, so on. And people, if they suddenly realize that they have only a week or 2 weeks left, they get very, very upset at not having been informed. There are some people, of course, who may never want to know, but most of us would want that grace period. Then our laws do not permit patients and families to take control. And this is somewhere between the doctors and the lawyers. Doctors are scared of making decisions to withdraw futile care, and the legal system is worried about this option being made available to doctors and being misused, as they say, by corrupt doctors and corrupt families. Except judges, everybody else is corrupt. You know that. So the default option is to continue till the bitter end. And then, if you remember what I told you about palliative care, we have poor access to systems that control suffering at the end of life. Simple things like morphine for physical pain. India produces more than 90% of the world's morphine. And till a few years ago, if you wanted morphine for cancer pain at the end of life, you would have to beg, borrow, and steal, really. But more importantly, you need professionals who can address not just physical pain, but total pain, all kinds of suffering. And palliative care is a specialty that looks at managing all health-related suffering. But the first problem is the most important, and it's being flagged in the Mahabharata. So one of the questions that was asked to Yudhishthir by the Yaksh was, day after day, countless creatures reach. What is the greatest wonder? And Yudhishthir answered, day after day, countless creatures reach Yama's abode. Yet those that remain behind believe themselves to be immortal. And what can be more extraordinary than this? So 3,000 years ago. Sorry, is somebody playing my old one? Or is the YouTube running? Because I think the YouTube has a lag.
Yeah, it looks like anybody watching on YouTube and Zoom, kindly switch off your YouTube, please.
Yeah. Otherwise, you'll be hearing two of me and you'll be getting confused. So anyway, think of the last journey of your life, and then who has the information, who's planning it, and who has the responsibility. So let's look through these three questions. Who has the information? Now, foreseeing and foretelling was always the doctor's responsibility. And I think you'll agree with that. Except that somewhere in the middle of the last century, we gave up on it. Because treatment became so much easier that the emotionally difficult business of foreseeing and foretelling, prognosticating, dropped off our radar. Partly it was also because our patients became more empowered. And our patients insisted on us being not just honest, but also accurate and also optimistic. And this can be a difficult triad if you're not trained to do it. So between us and the patients, this thing grew up, and that was usko mat batao. It's rubbish that we allow because we doctors are not trained in the art of delivering bad news. And patients, family, community need to understand honesty really is the best policy, because if there is no honesty, when there is concealment, when there is collusion between family and doctors to hide the bad news from the patient, depression and anxiety worsen. So if there are any doctors here and their patients, please remember that if we put our minds to it, we can figure out when somebody is in their last years. One is what has been called the surprise question. An experienced doctor asked, would you be surprised if Mr. So-and-so would to pass away in the next 1 year? And if the answer is no, I would not be surprised. This is an intuitive answer, which is based on your clinical picture, social factors, the other illnesses they have, and so on. And it's been proven that the experienced doctor has probably an 80% accuracy on this, 80 to 90%. What about general indicators decline? Somebody who's getting more and more, requiring more and more support, because it happens very, very slowly. Both the patient and the carers really don't pick it up. Somebody is requiring more and more help, or say, for instance, somebody is kidney failure, is on dialysis, and says, no, enough is enough. So that's when you know that things are now reaching a climax. Or there are specific medical indicators that are linked to the diagnosis that one carries. Say, for instance, the lung failure, then you can actually pick up indicators that say when somebody is close to the end. Sorry, my coffee is getting cold. But broadly, when you do this, there's an error rate of about 30%, which is linked to the kind of diagnosis, the predicted duration. The longer the duration that you quote, the more likely it can be off by 6 months or a year. So 100% answers are not possible. And the most important thing is both doctors and patients and family have to accept that there will be some uncertainty. But remember one thing, that if I feel that somebody has 60 to 70% chance of passing away in the next 1 year, remember that 60 to 70% goes on in the next year after that and the year after that. So if you look at it in a mathematical sense, if I say 70% in the next year, it's close to 100% in 3 years. So till we reach the stage that doctors are willing to tell and their patients are willing to hear, literally, the policy is don't ask and don't tell. So let me point out to you again that the destination cannot be changed, but decisions can be made about what the journey should be like, but it needs you to be aware and to take charge. And if you do that, a good death is when somebody knows when death is coming and can understand what can be expected, so that there is time to say goodbye, control the timing, and not to have life prolonged pointlessly. That allows that person to have control over maintaining dignity and maintaining privacy. And that is partly through doing advance directives. And that person should ideally have complete unrestricted access to pain relief and other symptom control and spiritual and emotional support, whatever it takes to make sure that the handover to Yama is handled as gracefully as possible. Two stories that came out during the lockdown. One was Irfan Khan, and just read that quote. It still sticks in my throat. He actually said that. How many people have the chance to observe death coming in? I'm lucky that I can see this thing approach and I can greet it. Must have been a very brave man. And then Rishi Kapoor. This went on. I mean, his illness went on for about 2 years. And he knew it. And he was sure that he wanted to enjoy his life in whatever time he had. And he did it. So the point is, who is planning your last journey? Is it you? Is it someone you trust? Because if it's on default mode where nobody is planning, that is when the worst suffering happens. Suffering can be minimized by palliative care. But if nobody is able or willing to make decisions, then it just multiplies. Remember that if you can speak coherently, you decide, and your choices and decisions always come first. You have to be clear about this. This is an absolute statement. But the problem is that you may not be able to decide right till the end, because we look at something called decision-making capacity. Now, I do this instantly and informally, literally every day. But it can be assessed formally if somebody understands the situation they are in, understand the consequences, and show judgment. So doctors can do it formally too. The thing is that once the dying process begins, which is say about days, maybe at the most a couple of weeks before actual death, most people lose this decision-making capacity because they start going in and out of consciousness. With cancer, this happens up to weeks before death. And if somebody has organ failure, say for instance, if they have liver failure, then every time they come into a crisis, they lose it and then they come out. But if somebody has dementia, they may have lost it a decade before death. Does that mean that one will always lose control in that? No, not if you plan for it. And that is where this term living wills came up. Now, the term living wills applies to the document that I'll show you. But actually, we now call them advanced medical directives because living wills are basically, this is living wills as opposed to estate wills. For instance, an estate will comes into effect only when you are actually dead. Living wills come into effect while you're still alive. That's why they were called living wills. But we now include a couple of other things in that, and that's called the advanced medical directive. But the whole process of talking about it, planning, is called advanced care planning. And that is where we need to hit. And the basic principle is that I have the right to determine my own future, to accept or decline any therapy, or at least to decide who decides for me. Now, is this absolute? in its absolute sense, yes, it is a Western concept. And for us in Asia, especially in India and China and even in the Far East, we look at it in terms of relational autonomy. And relational autonomy means that I decide this in consultation with my family, people around me, and so on. And but yes, one decision I do have to make is that I decide versus I decide who decides, or I specifically avoid all discussion or decision making, and that gives you suffering by default. So if you look at these decision making roles, it splits into I decide versus let others decide. And in the I decide, you are the autonomist who takes responsibility because it's my body, it's my right, or the altruist who says I don't want to give anybody trouble. I don't want to put this difficult job on somebody else. And most usually the people who decide are a combination of these two. Whereas the I cannot decide, it is too painful, let others decide, either authorize, meaning they explicitly authorize, which I think is the minimum that one can do, or the absolute truster who transfers authority by implicit authorization, which is a little tricky because, we found out repeatedly that without open discussion, the people who are supposed to make these decisions don't know what the choices were. So some amount of discussion is required. So whether you're an authorizer or a truster, you do need to at least talk about what you want. And of course, some people completely want to avoid it. And there again, that's a problem. So if possible, all of us have to think of at least 3 people who can accept this responsibility and are available. Put them in sequence. First decision maker, second decision maker, and a third decision maker. Remember, this is not a committee. They will talk to each other, but only one person decides. And there's a little bit of a trick here. You want the person, these people who decide, please the first decision maker to be somebody who understands your wishes. Not somebody who says, okay, you signed, okay. When you end up in the ICU, I'll go there and tell them to take the ventilator off. That is a little too cold. Or you have the other side. Somebody who says, no, uncle, or whatever, I love you so much. I'm going to keep you like as you are in the ICU, even if it takes 20, 30 years. No way. That's too warm. You want somebody in between. You want somebody who speaks to you, understands the limits you set, and then depending on the amount of discretion you allow them, then carries out your wishes. People often put their spouses as the first decision maker, but the reason why you need another 2 is what if I and my partner were to be caught in an accident together? That would be really terrible. Nobody to decide. Okay, so that's the first decision. The next decision is, where do you want this care to be done? Now, if you say hospital, then this ends up being acute care and the ICU. And I've yet to meet an intensivist who likes the idea of dying in his own ICU. And ICU means the lights are on constantly, there's noise, and there are strange, masked young creatures doing painful things to you, and maybe even laughing while they're doing it. Really. So this is the reality of life-saving treatments. Life-saving treatments include IV fluids, artificial tube feeding, of course dialysis, of course ventilation, of course chemotherapy, and of course something called cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now, in many patients, they do save lives, but in most others, they only prolong the dying process. And remember that cardiopulmonary resuscitation, when it is performed, you may have seen enough TV serials where somebody collapses and falls down and somebody comes up and pumps their chest, and 2 minutes later that person is sitting up and saying what happened and stuff like that. No, that happens in less than 2 to 5% of people. So if somebody gets a cardiac arrest, even in hospital, the likelihood that that person will walk out of the hospital is max about 10 to 15%, really. And it's a very, very painful process. If in an older person, if it has to be effective, ribs have to be broken, literally, because that's the amount of pressure that is pushed on the heart to start it. And if all of this is put into play, then literally on one side, you have the irresistible force of biology and you have immovable technology, and you get ground down between the two of them. Not something that anybody should want. So if you do not want to go into the ICU, but you cannot manage things at home, then hospital wards are possible, but with clear instructions that there will be no going to the ICU. And we do it when the family cannot manage at home and say what we call a hospice is not available. Of course, people do have access to extended care facilities, assisted living, and so on. Hospices in India, as of now, are currently available only for cancer. The only one that I know which is general is in Goa. But as I said, most people would prefer home, and that is what surveys after survey have shown. Let me tell you that, well, this is the place that I have chosen. I don't know when that time will come, but if and when, I'd prefer to be sitting here and having my single malt. Is it possible to pass away comfortably at home? Yes, it is. Well, the two Bushes did it. Of course, you can say that they had access to all of this, but that is not so. It is the norm in rural Kerala, not in Mumbai, maybe not even in Chennai, but the rural Kerala manages to do it. This is because palliative care has literally spread down to the community in Kerala. And sometime last year, I'd gone on rounds with this friend of mine in Calicut. And this is supported by community donations. There's a chai shop and people put coins in. That's where it gets run. So, but for all of us, I think the basic thing that we should be doing is to making the advanced medical directive. And for this advanced medical directive, you have to be an adult. And it comes into effect when you can no longer obviously take part in the decision making regarding your medical treatment. And at that stage, if 3 doctors together confirm that you have reached the stage of terminal illness and in coma with no hope of recovery, or no hope of recovery with a quality of life which you deem acceptable, or a persistent vegetative state, then any life-sustaining treatments that have been started should be removed, or at least should not be started. And to secure compliance with this declaration, I appoint my surrogate decision makers or healthcare power of attorney. Now, this healthcare power of attorney supersedes anybody in the family. And that is what is important. And the healthcare power of attorney, you may either give them the discretion to discuss with the doctor, or the healthcare power of attorney only has the responsibility of seeing that your wishes are followed. And as I said, it has to be at least 3 people in sequence. This remains in force during my lifetime unless I revoke it. And to revoke it, you can just revoke it orally at any time. So if you're awake and you're communicating, your doctor it is necessary that your doctor asks you, this was your living will, do you still wish it to be followed? And if you say no, it's revoked instantly. Now, this document, I've already sent it, but if you want to download it, or if you want to tell anybody, just type in the search box living will, and any one of these 3 words, Vidhi, Pallium, or Indian Association of Palliative Care, all 3 websites have it, and you will just go to you'll get that page instantly and you can download it. So the living will is just a document. As you can understand, it requires a process and a system to make it effective. So, and as I said earlier, it's always been amazing to me that this is something that we are so far behind on. And the reason now is pretty obvious to me. There is no medical industrial complex that pushes this. Who wants it? Who needs it? Us, the citizens of India. And us, the citizens of India, very often don't know what we need. So the system is called advanced care planning. It's a process to guide decision making about your health care if and when you do not have the capacity to decide for yourself. As you will have understood by now, it has two major components. That's why the Living Will has now changed to Advanced Medical Directive. It has first the appointment of a proxy decision maker, and the second is the guidance for the proxy decision maker. And that guidance for the proxy decision maker is the Living Will. But essentially, it begins with a conversation between the person concerned, you, your family, and or the power of attorney if they are separate, preferably your healthcare providers. And ideally, in the rest of the world, wherever it is done systematically, you have trained facilitators or counselors who take you through this kind of decision making. And this is something that we intend to set up. Our group is working on having this set up, or at least training existing counselors in this. This whole thing is then included in your medical record, and there's a system to see that this is acted on. And if you wish to look this up, you will get details of how to begin this conversation in the Conversation Project. That's a search term, theconversationproject.org. Now, it's of course very anglicized and Americanized, but you can still get enough tips for yourself. It will be used if and when you lack the capacity to be your own decision maker, and it provides guidance for your surrogates or your proxy and your healthcare provider at office. Because if there is no decision and or decision maker, the medical team really gets confused. Now, the problem in India is that there is really no legislation even for this. What happens if somebody doesn't have a surrogate? Elsewhere, and this is the system that we follow, at least at Hinduja Hospital. It is the first is a spouse, the second is an adult child, a majority of available adult children, then parents, then an adult sibling, and then the nearest adult who's not described above. This is a system we follow. And recently, the All India Institute of Medical Science Delhi put out their policy, and that also has a sequence. So I feel that we will probably be following this, since this is the only statutory one that is out. But for those who are outside conventional family structures, it's important to be able to actually appoint a proper proxy decision maker, because you may be estranged from family, you may not want the family to be involved in this decision maker. And the Supreme Court, as part of the whole judgment that came out, I'll speak about that, has authorized us to appoint one. Now, when do you do this, all of this process? Ideally, it is with any trigger events, so a new diagnosis, a hospitalization, or change in care needs. But actually anytime, because it's been quipped. It always seems too soon until it is too late. So anytime. What about somebody who's young and healthy? Not me, obviously, but yeah. Say somebody who's even in their 40s. People who are very clear that they do not want to survive with catastrophic brain injury, because brain injury is the only thing that needs to be worried about if you're in your 40s. And let me give you two poster children for this. Barack Obama, in his first presidency, announced in public that he and Michelle had made their living wills. Now, why would this young man of 48 or 49 at that time do it? Well, because the US president has an occupational risk of being shot in the head. What about Michael Schumacher? Went through his racing career. We are not aware that he did it. His racing career ended with 500 million pounds of assets. And then he had this really stupid skiing accident where he literally just somersaulted and toppled on a stone and cracked his skull and was in coma. And 4 years later, he's still dependent. And at least when this report was written, his family had spent 25 million pounds on his rehabilitation and so on. It beats me that he would not have thought about this during his racing career. What about older people? Well, if any illness starts off, it's important to figure out what would you do if your illness takes a bad turn. So after the age of 60 years with any new diagnosis. This was my patient who was diagnosed with blood pressure. And soon after that, she really didn't take any treatment. She had a massive brain hemorrhage. And she came in And this was some years ago. So she got operated and literally her life was saved. In 6 months, all the tubes that were put into her throat, her stomach, her urine, everything came out. She's paralyzed on the left side, but on the right, her hands work. She can speak, and she does not like it at all. I mean, I've treated her for depression, but her decision doesn't change. She says, she actually keeps telling her husband, "Why did you do this to me?" And the husband, poor fellow, is in bad shape. Even though he has daughters who have assured him that they will help her and take care of her. But right now, as he says, I am alone. You think about what if she had a living will? What about somebody who's in the later years of life where the expected survival is 1 year or less? Now, abroad, when somebody reaches that kind of a stage, this is for the US, you have something called physician's orders for life-sustaining treatments. Now, if you look at the living will, it's not a directive. It's a directive, but it's not really a order. It doesn't say tick this, tick that, not to do this. It still requires another layer of decision making. What if that is speeded up and a final decision making order is made? So these are called physician's orders for life-sustaining treatments, and these are signed out by a doctor and either the patient or the surrogate, and they are printed in this luridly fluorescent colored sheets of paper, and they are put up in the US. Wherever the states that this works, these are put up everywhere in the records and so on. But they also come into people's homes, and typically these are put up on the fridge door. So if somebody has an acute event and is found unconscious by the neighbors or somebody, and when the paramedics arrive, the first thing they look at is that sheet. What were his instructions at that time? What were her instructions? So that is where ideally we have to reach. Some of this has been done, and this also has just happened. Literally in April 2020, this was something that we had been working on for the past year or so. And finally, this came through, at least for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is that final thumping of the chest and all that painful kind of thing. If you say that you do not want it, and if you sign that out, no doctor can do it to you. No doctor can do it to you if you have clearly said, no, I do not want it. And there is a specific form for this, which is clearly worded out, and you can ask for it and have it filled in. It's called the Do Not Attempt Resuscitation Form, DNAR. What if I change my mind? As I said, all of these, if you're conscious, awake, and able to speak, you can revoke it instantly orally. You can't make it again orally, but revoking orally. Now, how does this work out? You've already guessed this. 3 famous nonagenarians passed on in 2018. Barbara Bush in April, Atal Bihari in August, and George Bush in November. Both Barbara and George Bushes really died in their own beds, surrounded by their family, literally in Darbar. And you can see pictures of them with pets and grandchildren, everything. It happened because their system worked for them, and they themselves took charge of their last days. It's been written about that Barbara Bush actually signed out these orders, and she went home with clear understanding that she was never going to come back to hospital again. So where are we? Now, remember that our constitution, the preamble to the constitution, gives us liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. But the liberty of that constitution was for the last century. It was a political liberty. It had not been brought into the personal space, and 3 Supreme Court judgments, which came out within almost about a year and a half of each other, literally brought that into the personal space. One was the Puttaswamy judgment on privacy, then was the health autonomy, the common cause judgment that I'll speak about, and the sexual choice judgment that wrote down 377. But the common cause judgment, the one that we are talking about, has some problems. One is it has prescribed a procedure, which in the other 2 judgments, they actually did not prescribe any procedures. They said that the advanced medical directive will be applicable only to terminal illness. Now, Schumacher, like in a situation where he's brain damaged, but not terminally ill, how would you apply it? It has to be signed before a judicial magistrate first class, preserved in the district court, and informed to the family, which I mean goes against privacy. And what if a doctor refuses to acknowledge it? There's no mention of how it is to be enforced. So in this uncertain situation, what can you and I do? The first is start talking. You have to discuss these issues with your family. And the thing is very simple. We have to normalize talking about death. It has to become a routine topic of discussion at the dinner table. Because if it is not, as one of my patient's wife said, I mean, she literally started to weep when we were having this conversation. She said, "Ye baat to kabhi kari nahi." And as I said, it is always too early until it is too late. So to make this, start by speaking to those close to you. Choose your surrogates or your proxies carefully. Confirm that they accept the responsibility, understand your wishes, and will follow them. And then you also decide whether they have any discretion or they're just supposed to enforce your wishes. Then an advance medical directive has to be signed in front of 2 witnesses in the presence of and attested by a judicial magistrate first class. That is what the judgment of 2018 says. But in the rest of the world, only 1 or 2 witnesses are required. It is not even required to be attested, if at all a notary. But as of now, the judicial magistrate first class requirement is there. So what I suggest is at least complete the rest of the process. Speaking, choosing, writing. Maybe you can sign 1 document with witnesses until you get a judicial magistrate, and we'll speak about that. Make multiple copies, put it up in your medical record, see that everybody knows about it, put it up on the fridge, and keep it with you whenever you go, either to your doc or on admission for any procedure. And please, this is something that I require you to do. I'm begging you to do. Show it to every doctor you consult. Why? You will find out if she or he is willing to accept and support you. They will be able to find out their own hospital policy, so you'll know where to get admitted in emergency, and the doctor will know your wishes. But why am I begging you to do this? Because I need your help to make doctors understand how important this is. Most doctors don't, really. So as I said, I've been on this since 2011. And I come to the last thing that I wish to speak to you about, and that is asking for your help. And that help is actually pretty simple. As an organization, as a group, you can probably do this as a group. See that you approach judicial magistrate first class, get the signatures done in one go together. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be totally easy during this period of the pandemic, but it is something that can be done. And I think you're the ideal people to get this moving. So I'm going to end with this quote, which I don't need to tell you who said this. Be the change you wish to see in this world. Thank you. My email ID is here. So is my mobile number. You're welcome to WhatsApp me or email me for any details. Sheila is also there in the call. She will also help out. And I hope we can take this forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Roop. Thank you very much. I will definitely pass on your email ID and your contact number to all the veterans who are members of our association and to others who may require it. Now, before I open up the question and answer session to everybody, 2 questions I would like to ask you, sir. Sure. One is, first, you said there are 3 decision makers you have to nominate.
Yes. Now, sorry, I'm just trying to stop screen share. My arrow is doing a little funny things. Okay. I think maybe... okay. Go on. Okay. Shoot, I'll keep trying this. Yeah, done.
Yes.
There we are.
Now, when you said 3 decision makers, now, is it a consensus decision among the 3, or is it a majority decision, or anyone can decide?
No, they are in sequence. So if 1 is available, 1 decides. If 1 is not available, then 2 comes in. If 2 is not available, 3 comes in. Ideally, all 3 of them are around and they can talk to each other. But it is the first in the list who signs off. It is not all 3 of them signing together. It is not a committee. Committees are disasters.
Okay. And so the second question, you said that this is to be done in front of a judicial magistrate. Now, how practical it is, I'm not sure, because recently I had a case where a veteran passed away and there was a change of name to be effected in the wife's pensionary payment orders. And it said that this has to be signed by a chief judicial magistrate. So the poor lady had to run from pillar to post. And I believe in Tamil Nadu and Chennai, there is an unwritten thing that these people are being verbally told avoid signing any of these type of affidavits or requests. I don't know how is it in other parts of the country.
So I'll tell you that I didn't include that slide here. As of now, publicly, it apparently seems only 3 or 4 people have made these living wills as per the full format, including the judicial magistrate first class signature. And it is no surprise, all of them are legal personnel. so the rest of us have no chance, except that, well, you are an association, you have the strength of that. So it will be, I'm saying that you guys go ahead and make this document, have it witnessed. See, having spoken about it in the family and having a document which is clearly witnessed gives a lot of support to family when the time comes. Even if it is not, in that sense, completely legally foolproof. It may not be, but it is emotionally foolproof. That's important. So making it is important, but I would like you guys to give it a good try to get that JMFC signature, because, yeah, I mean, it's only when an association like of yours does that and you say we can't do it, that I suppose people will realize that, I mean, the authorities will realize that this is a completely pointless requirement. But we need somebody to at least start banging the doors.
Yeah, okay. There was one coming in in a chat from Rakesh Sharma sir, whether you would be sharing your slides.
Sure.
Okay, I will take it from you, sir. I will pass it on to people. Okay.
I think Mrs. Rajan she said something. She's coming
on. Now it's open to everybody to ask the question. Now, Mrs. Rajan, please.
Yes. Can you? I had a chat with one of my nephews who's a lawyer, and he advised that I should get my living will notarized first before we proceed further. Now, in this context, I would like to tell you, sir, that in 2015, my husband and I had prepared a simple living will where we insisted that we will not be intubated, put on dialysis, or have any kind of tubes put into our body. Now, he suffered a stroke and he was incapacitated, and therefore he was admitted to the Apollo Hospital. We did show the living will that we both had signed and witnessed it through the members of our community here in the flats. However, they said we'll have to catheterize him first. We will have to put in a feeding tube. Now, both these things my husband was against, but in the interest of trying to resuscitate or bring him back to normalcy, I acquiesced to those two. However, the situation worsened, and then they came back to me with the idea of intubation and a ventilator. There, I said, I'm sorry, I will not give further permission for any of these things to happen. You may please look at what he has written. In full, when he was in perfect health, he has written this. So I'm sorry, we will not give you permission. So the ICU doctors conferred. Then they said, we will, since it's not a legal document, this was in 2015. And so they went to their chairman, got it ratified. And I said, I will not permit ventilation no matter what you say. You're just going to prolong the agony of his suffering. I would rather he goes peacefully. Finally, they agreed and he was not intubated. They gave him something called power pack oxygen to sustain him for a while. and allowed me to bring in the family to bid goodbye to him, though the whole lot of us were there when he passed away. And the hospital was kind enough to acknowledge that humble statement that we had made. So it is possible, if we were to be absolutely certain in our minds that we don't want to prolong the agony, I suppose it happens. But I am now planning it on the advanced care assistance that you have talked about, having got a whole document from Singapore where my daughter is. She and her husband have already signed up for that. So I have got the matter, which I thought I will prepare a new one, have it witnessed by my doctor first and the other witnesses. No need for a doctor to witness?
No. The witness, ideally, see, the witness should only be somebody who confirms that it's your signature. That's all.
Okay. Then my children themselves are willing to do it.
Either that or even say a friend, or do it in front of a notary. The notary also becomes a witness. Yeah.
So I intend doing that and making sure that I will not be messed around with. Sorry, I mean, it's against medical ethics, but I think I will stick to my guns.
Your wishes are the first. I mean, at any time, it's the patient's wishes that matter most.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the first principle of our ethics. It's called patient autonomy. It's not against ethics. It is the first principle.
Thank you. Thank you for that word. Thank you.
Any more questions from anyone, please?
Yeah, I have one question.
Yes, Captain Ramachandran, sir, please go ahead.
Yeah, doctor, this when a doctor accepts this, I mean, which is not signed by the judicial magistrate or someone, is he legally accountable for this? I mean, just sort of academic.
So that is the issue. See, abroad, I mean, if I talk to my doctor friend, their main issue is if I take on board this kind of a document which is not legally valid, what if the fifth son from the US turns up 3 months later and says that you killed my father with my eldest brother?
Yeah.
So that's a hypothetical worry that doctors perpetually kind of flag. Okay. And the legal system also keeps saying that what if this document is not made properly? How do we know it's not being misused? I think our experience with this is very limited, but in the US, where they've been using it for 50 years, there are somewhere between 10 and 20 cases of actual documented misuse. In how many years? Okay. So misuse is something that is extremely uncommon, and you have to then flip it around and talk about enforcing it. Now, the thing is that if a doctor is not aware of this and completely clueless about this, yeah, that's always going to be a problem. So that's the reason why I said that you have to find out if the doctor that you normally go to, the hospital that you normally go to, is aware of this and is willing to follow it. And I can assure you that more and more of us are generally aware of it. The experience that Mrs. Rajan had at the Apollo Hospital, at that time, well, it was because of her forcefulness. But we now expect that that same experience will be formalized. In the sense that Apollo Hospital, you will not need to force this kind of decision. This kind of a document should be respected. I think most major corporate hospitals will now respect it. Enforcing it, no, that is still some way away. But we know that worldwide, the most of the cases that are brought against doctors and systems are by families who say that you tortured my loved one at the end by doing what he did not want to have done to him. So they sue for that. Now, Indian doctors are not aware of that. They're not aware that the bulk of these cases are actually going to be of that kind. Once it kind of sinks into their minds that, yes, that families are going to object to having this done against their wishes and that they will take action for that, then things will change. Now, I'm not asking any of you to be guinea pigs for stuff like that. Please But yeah, but let's get the word out.
Sir, why can't ICMR or someone pass this instruction to all the doctors and hospitals and the state associations?
Because the Supreme Court has passed a judgment that has made it very difficult for us. So the Supreme Court has, in that judgment, they've actually gone and put down procedures, which, say, for instance, in the sexual choice judgment or in the privacy judgment, they did not do. So the government and people could work their way out around it. In this one, they literally put down a procedure. Now that is become a headache. Until that is amended, we are stuck with that procedure. Now the procedure is for withdrawal. So if somebody is intubated on the ventilator and the ventilator has to be removed, then frankly, for me to be safe, I have to follow that procedure. But if in advance, like Mrs. Rajan, the statement is made, no, you will not do this to me, then that is withholding. And that is very clearly covered by the judgment, that nothing can be done to you against your will. Even if it should cause your death. Even if that decision should cause your death, it cannot be done to you against your wishes. That's called withholding. Withholding is clear. Withdrawal, tricky, which is why this document becomes so important.
Right, sir. The next question for you is from Captain Sivasalam, sir. Captain Sivasalam, sir, you had a question. You had raised your hand.
A person is brain dead and certified by neurologist.
Yes, sir. I was I'm one of the prospective candidates for signing this will. But then the living will is painless, but the process seems to be painful. I will once again come back to the same subject, the judicial magistrate. It's not that easy, whether it is pandemic or non-pandemic, it's going to be very difficult. But I have seen a judgment wherein it says that wherever judicial magistrate's intervention is required, it can be replaced by the oath commissioners. That is a notary public. So I will have a further dialogue with you on this so that I can also move the government towards relaxing this provision so that the process becomes painless. And your request, in fact, you said begging, I take it as a request. I will also conduct 2 more camps where the average age of my group members is about 75. And we will make it popular. I think we'll have to spread the message about well-being wills. I will do that. I will cooperate with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was a question about brain death. I think somebody was asking.
Rukmani Gopal, ma'am, you had a question?
Yes, sir. So, unless a person is brain dead, that too certified by a neurologist, the ICU doctors will not listen to all of us. They will keep doing with whatever they can do, put this, put that, and all that. So, how much this living will help us? I mean, that kind of decision.
So, which is why I see it is 2 things in one. It needs your wishes to be clearly expressed. And a person to stand there and say, these are his or her wishes, follow them, like Mrs. Rajan did, follow them. So somebody has to stand there and say it. Ideally, I mean, it should not need. Your wishes should be enough. But we are at that in-between stage where you need somebody to stand there and say.
That's the point.
I have one small information for you, doctor. A friend of mine suddenly became brain dead and she had no children of her own. Her sisters were caring for her. There came a time when they had to take a decision as to what to do for her. In this connection, I asked my lawyer nephew whether we can have a paragraph inserted in the living will that in the event we get suddenly incapacitated and are unable to make our own decisions, can the power of attorney holder take charge?
Yeah.
He is still coming back to me on that. He said, let me study it and get back to you. Now, by which time my friend has already expired. And there was a lot of confusion over the assets and so on and so forth, because she had not left a clear-cut instruction on the whole. So even if what would you suggest? In our living will, can we insert a paragraph saying, in the event of a sudden incapacitation and being bedridden, the power of attorney holder for healthcare should take charge and dispense with whatever has to be done?
Correct.
And
But that's part of it.
Inserted?
Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. So the document that I've put on, if you read through it, you'll see it's got all of that. It's a little simpler. The Singapore one is a little more elaborate because they are more advanced on it, and their system supports it. But ours is it's complete. Sorry, there was.
I've got a question for you. Mohan, kindly go ahead with your question. Unmute yourself, please, first.
Yeah. Sir, as they were discussing earlier, I had a similar problem with my father-in-law, who was an ex-army veteran. He was admitted for disc prolapse at 96 at Apollo, Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh. And we were there with him. The same thing happened after a certain time. They could not perform the operation as such because he could not take the anesthesia. Then he was absolutely mentally very fully fit. Suddenly he suffered a stroke, and after that he was sinking. They wanted to give him on ventilator, but we very clearly, he didn't have any living will, although he wanted to donate organs, but that they could not do it because he was not in a fit condition to do that. But on our undertaking, we did not permit him to give they did not permit them to put the ventilator. The rule they said was, if he is in the hospital and if he is in emergency, we have to give him ventilator and intubation. But we said no. But on that case, they wanted us to take him back. But fortunately, we had some people at the corporate office. We could keep him there, and he breathed this last in October. Early last month. So even if there is no will, if as you said, the next of kin and whoever is admitted, if he gives us in writing and if we impress upon the doctors, they do oblige.
Okay. So it is not a question of obliging. It is their duty. See, at some stage when you cannot cure somebody, the doctor's responsibility changes over to care. Okay. And this is unfortunately in those places where we are in a process of evolution. And very often smaller hospitals who are unsure of themselves will do what is called LAMA, left against medical advice. So they've told you to leave. They've told you to pay the bills and get going.
Yes.
Yeah. But, and then they write left against medical advice. Now that is illegal. They are not supposed to do that. If you've decided that, that cure is not possible and that you wish to be cared for, I mean, it's their duty. Unfortunately, as I explained to you that bit about palliative care, and Sheila and I, we work together on that. So palliative care is a specialty that is spreading. So for instance, if this situation were to arise in Hinduja, then, or even in major hospitals in Chennai, the palliative care physician would be called in and he would take over from that point.
They were not able to do that also in my father-in-law's case. Because they were not able to put that injection spinal. So they put a patch, which was normally done for terminal patients of cancer.
Fair enough. But that's quite okay. I mean, the most important thing is that he had a peaceful passing.
Yeah.
I think that is the priority, and that I can tell you, even that takes a lot of training and skill.
Thank you, sir.
Right, sir. Right. Commander Gurunath Reddy has got a question for you. Wing Commander Gurunath Reddy, can you please come up with your question?
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
Sir, what about parents who are not very literate, and how to educate them for signing all these forms and all?
I think the important thing is to start the conversation. So if you look at the conversation project, you will see where these, and very often, these statements float around. You talk about somebody who had a bad passing and somebody says, oh my God, I don't want that. When that conversation comes up, do not say, don't talk about this. That's the point. That's the time to pick it up and say, okay, let's talk about it sometime. And you will get indicators of how to do that. I mean, once the conversation is had, you will find that the rest of the process is extremely simple. And well, if somebody is really completely illiterate, maybe you could even record their whatever they want, or they on the video, on the mobile phone. Keep it as a record for the rest of the family. I mean, then all that you need is that statement that is made. You don't really need it to be written down. It's basically for the family to know.
I have a younger brother as a doctor, sir. So
okay.
How best I can use him for helping out my parents? So this is
I think it's, I don't think doctors are better or worse at this kind of conversation. Finally, it's all about emotional sensitivity and willingness to take on a slightly painful topic. You'll probably find sometimes doctors are worse at it than people who are clued in. So that I think is a personal responsibility. Just look at the conversation project. You will not find it difficult.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
A couple of more questions coming up for you. I hope you don't.
Yeah. I'm
this extended session. Wing Commander Ravi Mani, sir.
Doctor, good afternoon. I'd like to know how we can collectively move forward and push for a better legislation, given the infirmities in the country.
So that came up a little while earlier. So what I suggest is, now the Supreme Court, for whatever reason, because they were worried about misuse, they put down all these requirements and safeguards, as they put them. But health is a concurrent issue. If any state legislature were to pass a law for a living will, it would take the place of the Supreme Court legislation. I mean, obviously, Tamil Nadu cannot pass a law for Maharashtra, but it can pass it for Chennai. I mean, it can pass it for Tamil Nadu proper. So if we have a law on the living will purely for Tamil Nadu, that serves your purposes. And if anybody needs any assistance, so one of the websites that I put up there is Vidhi Legal Policy. That's a think tank based in Delhi. Dr. Dhwani Mehta is one of the partners there. I mean, she's a PhD doctor from Oxford in law, and she's been helping us with this. And they will be very happy to help you to draft the law and to because for government it becomes a headache. Who's going to write the law? Who's going to give them that? We'll take care of all of that. But yes, somebody needs to push it. And Tamil Nadu could well be the first state to do it.
Thank you, Doctor.
Harsha, you're muted.
Yeah.
Sir, there's a question coming up in the chat box for you. This is from Mrs. Sheila Jayawant. She says that if there is an advance directive and it is not respected / followed, would it amount to battery?
Yes, it would. I am So the first, my colleagues often tell me that what if we get hit by a court case? I tell them that the only court case that we know of in this regard is a consumer court case from Delhi, where a hospital that kept a brain dead boy on the ventilator for 10 days after they had decided he was brain dead. Well, the family sued them and got 5 lakhs for it. So the only case is actually in the other direction. And worldwide, that's where it happens. So somebody who's made a clear-cut instruction has clear-cut instructions of do not resuscitate. And they do the CPR process and put him on the ventilator, and then whatever has to happen happens later, or maybe it does not, or the patient eventually comes out very, very significantly ill and suffering. Families abroad sue for that. So until that starts to happen, I think, So as far as corporate hospitals are concerned, we are working on them. In fact, we have a document out with FICCI, where they have been, their private hospitals have been told that it is in their own interest to be aware of this situation and to start putting together the infrastructure for following this. But I think Apollo is doing it. Hinduja obviously does it. Manipal, the whole Manipal system has implemented it. AIIMS is doing it it's done it for Delhi, and I'm sure it will follow it for the other AIIMS elsewhere. So it will spread.
Right, sir. So the next question coming up for you is from Major General Rajavelu. Raj, sir, your question, please.
Doctor, it was really a very wonderful and informative lecture, at least for us senior citizens. From the talk, what I gather is, see, at what point of time, as to when this particular living will is going to come into effect. So I understand that it will be decided by the power of attorney. But let's say if I say that when I get hospitalized, if I have a chance of about 60% or a 70% or 80%, success, or to have another about 6 to 7 years of good life, then that should be some sort of cutoff point when that particular living will should get executed. What do you say about this?
No, so you see, it's always tricky, and everybody has their own different set point. Everybody has their own set point. It's not an easy conversation to have, but so that's why I take you back to say, if you are young, like I trek, and at this moment, if I were in a situation where I could not be speaking to you guys, or I could not be outdoors, that would be unacceptable. I would much rather prefer to be allowed to go. Okay, but somebody else may not. Somebody else may say, that's quite okay. As long as I can sit around and be played with my grandchildren or whatever, that's more important to me. Or I want to, more importantly, I want to wait till my first grandchild is born. Or things like that. Everybody has their own particular specific choice. Now, that is why we say that ideally, I mean, for this kind of document to be totally effective, it has to be made with a counselor. But till that happens, I think the best thing is you will need to just work on that document that we have given and put down your individual choices. That if you say, ideally your proxy should be able to talk to the doctors, get this figure, how much percentage of chances, and so on, and then take that decision. So what does this mean? It means that you have thought this through of what is the minimum basic that you want. Your proxy is aware of it. And that discussion takes place frankly between the proxy and the doctor at the time. Now this takes, if you want a discretionary kind of a document, yes, then it requires a fair amount of discussion between you and your proxy and the doctor. But if you're very clear, only this or nothing, then obviously things become easier. I hope I'm clear, because, but then the point is, if you do not, then, if you do not have this kind of discussion, then it becomes, your family completely, I've seen families get completely shattered because they just can't figure out.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor.
Any more questions, please, for Dr. Roop?
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Yeah, Harsha.
Yes, sir. How about you?
Good morning, Dr. Roop. Thank you very much for a very, very comprehensive talk today. I don't know how to form this question, but this is an experience we had last year. Eva Marshall, who had expressed orally his wishes not to be resuscitated and things like that, had to go into the hospital, and his children were willing to follow his desire. But when it came to the point where he had to be ventilated, and the children said, no, my father did not want it, the wife, the first person that you had put in the list, she insisted that for whatever it is worth, he must have the ventilator. And this is the kind of dilemma that the children were torn between. Adult children who have their own teenage children and all, they've come down from US. They had a dilemma whether to honor their father's desire or upset their mother over here. And do you think, had he written a will, but then it brings an emotional kind of element into it, because even if they have executed his will, it would have left the mother with a kind of antipathy towards them, that you did not listen to what I wanted my husband to live, kind of thing. Do you think, had he written a will?
Yeah, so again,
But then it brings
so
an emotional kind of element.
that's on the YouTube. Okay.
Even if
So what I suggest is, that's why the conversation, obviously that conversation was not had between the two of them. That conversation between the two of them, and perhaps, you know, there's this friend of mine in Canada. She's a doc, of course, and she's very clear. She said, my husband is not going to be my power of attorney, because he said very clearly, I love you so much that I'll keep you whatever you are. She said, no way I'm going to let him take this decision for me. So yeah, but you know, once these discussions are had, and once they are handled sensitively, so when this final point comes, ideally between the wife and the kids and the hospital, there should have been somebody from palliative care, counselors who would have been able to take them through that decision making. I go through this, and I mean, this is something that we call it shared decision making. It's a formal process, and we are supposed to be trained in doing this. And obviously, it helps if these questions are sorted out in advance, and you know, everybody is aware of what is wanted and so on. Because if it is not legally, what happened was absolutely correct. She was the first surrogate. Since there was nothing in writing, the hospital had no choice but to follow her instructions.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. It's been a great morning. And now I request our President M. Marshall Varthaman to kindly take over, sir, and conclude the meeting.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for a very informative talk. I must say this is the second time I'm hearing your talk. And after I heard you the first time, I said we must spread the gospel. And more people must hear you, so that we spread the message. And so many of us have heard you today, and I'm sure we will move it forward, and we will do whatever is necessary for ourselves, of course, and for the community at large. Thank you very much for taking time off and speaking to us and patiently answering all our questions. And on behalf of us, we must commend you for your passion to move this idea and the concept forward. We all need to thank you for that. And while I thank you, I need to thank Mrs. Sheila Jayawant, who actually introduced us to you and facilitated this morning's talk. Thank you very much, Sheila. Thank you for your passion. And we will keep in touch. And there are many things we need to do. You've given us a lot of homework, actually. We need to do a lot of things. I assure you we will do that and move this thing forward and look after ourselves. Like I said, we are all senior citizens, and you already put us in that bracket where we better be very fast at making that will.
Sir, I'm not very far behind.
But from all of us, may you continue trekking and enjoy your treks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Bye.
Thank you. And
thank you.
Very nice talk.
Thanks.
There are some questions which people had asked regarding the addresses and what you call websites. I will put it up on our group, and we will spread the word around. And Mr. Sivasayalam is still here, I think. Mr. Sivasayalam?
Yes.
Neenga irukkinga. We may move it forward as far as the Tamil Nadu government is concerned.
Yeah, we will do that, sir.
Yes. So we can, and in fact, the doctor gave us a reference of one lady in Delhi. I'll get that reference as well.
Okay.
And we can use her services. And he said, if you produce the ready-made document, it's easy for the government to work on.
We will.
Sir, we are from other places like Hyderabad and Belgaum and other